Good morning, everybody. Today we want to finish. I'm a little behind on the Samuel study, and we want to do 1 Samuel 29 and 30. I was going to do it Thursday, and I didn't get to do it Thursday, and then yesterday was rainy. I wanted to do it outside somewhere, so I feel like I get behind because I'm reading through the Bible and New Testament, Old Testament, and these studies are just, when I start reading through a Bible book, if I start commenting on it, then I think, oh, let me just put those studies together. But they're really not planned, so they kind of got to fit in along with my regular routine. I might talk about that a little bit, how the letters of the New Testament, which we really, people that study, scholars and all, you can really obviously do deep teaching when you read the letter of Romans or Galatians or even Hebrews. But it's important for us to remember that Paul the Apostle, writing those letters, I think he wrote Hebrews. Scholars debate this thing. But he was doing it sort of like somebody on the run, okay? If you read the story of Paul in the New Testament, being persecuted, going from city to city, at one point being stoned. Some people think he died and had a death experience. So now all of these letters are written. We have some that are called the prison epistles. So even though they have a lot of deep theological truth, they were not penned by somebody sitting in an ivory tower. Okay, so it was the embracing of the life of the cross, which I talked about on the previous video, that these things are coming out. All right, and so that's how God is working in the church. And I just mentioned that because I'd like to do a flow. I don't like to sit down for a few days and study something. I'd prefer to just kind of like read it. These two chapters, I'll do a few little notes. I've been getting with a lot of my friends that are homeless, and there's a lot of good stories I could share. I'll do one about one of the dogs that's a community dog. Her name is Paisley. There's a friend of mine that has two dogs, a pit bull called Fat Boy, and then a cute female dog. The bull is a male. The female dog, she's kind of a mix, but she's cute, and they call her Paisley. And I remember Paisley when she was a little puppy, and now she's bigger, still young. But Paisley is kind of like a street dog in the sense that she'll go from the park to the mission, and sometimes she'll just show up on her own. She's learned how to cross the street. Sometimes she'll wait for somebody that's going to cross. And she drove in my car a couple times because I dropped off two friends at the park yesterday or the day before. And that cute dog was up at the mission. And the park is about maybe a mile away, and people just walk. But you got to walk across the street and everything, HEB. So I was giving two friends a ride, and then Paisley started following. So we said, oh, yeah, she could just jump in the car. So she's cute. She learns how to live. And the other day I was even saying, where's Paisley? You know, nobody saw her at the mission, and I worry sometimes because she's not on a leash, okay? And the cops, there's a lady cop that's nice to the dogs. She feeds them and everything, the guys were telling me. So the cops don't, you know, that they just say if there's people in the park, try to put those dogs on a leash. And then as I was saying, I haven't seen Paisley today. I was at the park. Sure enough, she showed up and her paws were all dirty. They said, oh, she was running around and she was tired. You could see, and she gets fed. The people make sure she gets food, my homeless friends, and water. And so one of the ladies made chicken and dumplings. I don't eat during the day, but it was nice. Claire made it for everybody. And I noticed George, who's one of my friends. George is a severe alcoholic. But then when Paisley showed up, George, he gave her a bowl of that chicken and dumplings. But it was interesting because this cute little dog has learned how to survive on the street. And she's taken care of, and she sleeps in the camps. The guys that are homeless, you know, sleeping on the street. But she'll stay with those. And I just thought that was interesting, how Jesus talks about how God takes care of the birds. And I just watched that, you know, play out. One note on, I don't want to do a lot of news things and politics, but I do listen and watch the news every day. I noticed there was an interview on NPR News yesterday when I'm listening to NPR News on the radio. And it was one of our military guys or spokesman for the military, and it was NPR is a liberal news organization, those who are familiar. But they interviewed him about what they're now calling the weaponization of language. This is very dangerous. Basically, I do understand we have a problem with radical groups, ISIS and others, who use Twitter and all and YouTube, and that's how the conversation was going. And, you know, we obviously do not want people to use social media to recruit people to do radical, you know, jihad. But as they were using the term weaponization of language, they were basically introducing something that I don't think is good, meaning we can now see certain types of language as weapons, quote, later on they'll say, of mass destruction. And we live in a world of propaganda. We live in a world where, and the liberal NPR interviewer then did a good job and asked that military man, do we ever weaponize language? And he did not give a clear answer, meaning, do we ever use propaganda? Of course we do. Of course we do. You know, I could talk about the history of war and how when you are fighting an enemy, regardless of what side it is, the media is always used to begin to demonize the enemy in a particular way, to make them. I'll give you a quote from Truman, okay? So going back, I could pick different ones. Truman, obviously, during the time of World War II and our war with the Japanese. And a lot in the media portrayed, if you look at some of those old propaganda commercials and all, portrayed them as insects, rats, mice. There was a lot of images that you saw. And Truman was a product of his age and grew up in a time where there was racism. But I heard a quote. This was an actual quote because I'm watching some documentaries on these things. But it was a racist quote. It came back from the days when he was not president at that time, but he said, this is how God created man. He made white men out of the dust. This is an actual quote, all right? Then he made the black man, and he referred to him as nigger on that particular clip they had. And then he threw out what was left, and we got the Chinaman. Now, he was a product of his age, but I'm just showing you how even language affects us, how we perceive things. And so I didn't like hearing that term, weaponization of language, because you could be tricked into thinking some things are really good and some things are really bad. If I told you, I got to do Samuel, but if I told you I had a cause that I believed in, whatever that cause was, and I went in front of a train because I thought the people on the train were doing things. Now, even if I'm not thinking right, but I think this train is headed and it's going to do very bad things in my mind. And I stood in front of that train and I held a steel rod or whatever, and I gave my life to derail that train. Regardless of whether I was right or wrong in my thinking, to die like that, would you perceive that to be that I was really, regardless of human life? Or would you say, well, at least he really believed in that cause? But say if then I saw that train coming, and I sat in this mansion on a hill somewhere, and then I flew a little remote control plane, and that plane went in and hit the guy in the plane, but I made sure I was not close because I didn't want to get hurt. Which one is more just? I mean, which one is more courageous? But we live in a day where, even in the World War II, when you look at the kamikaze pilots, when they were hitting our ships, I think they sunk 30 ships during the war. The kamikaze pilots, the Japanese, who flew their planes and died. They messed up 300 but I think they sunk 30. And they're normally looked at as, regardless of the view, as men, they gave their lives for that cause. But most of us that live in this country, whenever we see in the area of radical Islam, and look, I'm not justifying people blowing themselves up, but whenever we see somebody who blows themselves up taking other life, which I don't condone it, but most of us are still viewing that as they are cowards. No, they're deluded. Use the right terminology. They're deluded, but that's not cowardice. In their delusion, they figure we're going to go ahead and blow ourselves up and kill other people, which is wrong. But we have been convinced. See a lot of people report that that's an act of cowardice. See, that's what propaganda does. It doesn't let us see. Okay, Samuel 29 and 30. This is the chapters, and we'll be done in one more video on Samuel. But King David at this stage, like I said on the previous Samuel video, I believe he was going to try to reconcile with King Saul in this battle. There is a great battle coming up. The last video I taught it. Saul sought the advice of a witch, a medium, and he's told by Samuel, who comes back from the dead, the spirit of Samuel, Saul is told, that's it, tomorrow in the battle you're going to die. You and your sons will be with me. Now, Saul's going to go out to the big battle with leading the children of Israel, and the Philistines are preparing to fight with Saul. And as they get ready for this engagement, David, who was with the Philistines, and like I said earlier, he was fighting secretly on the side of his people Israel, but the king of the Philistines, Achish, he thought King David was really on the Philistine side. So in this chapter 29, the Philistines are getting ready to go to war with Israel against King Saul and Israel. And David's like, this is my chance. I believe David was going to show himself loyal and turn against the Philistines. But what happens in chapter 29 is King Achish, and I want you to see the types of Christ. Most of all, the symbols we get from, because David, really we're seeing images, not in the killing and all, but in his rule and in his kingdom and everything that we teach in the Old Testament. So, here is one type of a symbol of Christ we're going to see. Achish, the other lords of the Philistines who are going to fight this big battle with Israel, they ask King Achish and they say, what is David doing with us? Isn't this David the one that they said Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s of us, the Philistines? And King Achish tells the other lords of the Philistines who are all getting ready to fight Israel, he says, oh no, David has been noble all this time. I have found no fault in David. Now King Achish was really deceived by David because David was at fault. But in this symbol and in the wording, I see how Pilate also says to Christ, I have found no fault in him. And King Achish in chapter 29 will say that a few times. He has been blameless. I have found no fault in him. He's here before my court, if you will, just like Jesus in Pilate, okay? Now, because I think David did get out of the will of God in trying to do this little plan, which had the other lords of the Philistines said to Achish, and they had it right, I think. They said, don't let David go with us to fight. He'll turn against us, he'll fight on the side. And what better way would David use to reconcile to his former king than that? And that's exactly what I think David was going to do. So King Achish tells David, you can't go. Sorry, brother, you can't fight with us today. And David's response is, why not? And you can see him want to do it. Now, as David heads home, he was living in a little town. I talked about it. He said, give us a little place out in the country, if you will, because he was secretly fighting the enemies of Israel. So he didn't want King Achish, the king of the Philistines, to know what he was up to. So the little town he's in is called Ziklag. Used to have a whole radio series on Ziklag, just a teaching from Nehemiah, Ezra. I don't have those anymore. So as he gets back to his town, now understand this dynamic right now. David was thinking this is going to be a good day. All the time that he was estranged from King Saul, in his mind he thought, today's the day, I'm going to get the big battle, I'm going to reconcile. But then he had this disappointment where Achish said, no, you cannot fight with us. Okay, this is the beginning of a bad day now. Something that was good is beginning, in his mind, turning bad. So he didn't have the vision he hoped he was going to accomplish. And when he gets back to his town called Ziklag, this is now Samuel chapter 30, the enemies came in and were raiding the land. Some enemies that were raiding Israel and Philistine land and all, they were just another enemies in the land. And they happened to have raided David's hometown, where all their wives, their children, everything was back at the fort, if you will. And when David got back, this is why it's important now to understand that when, I'll show you just something if I remember. When David got back to his town, they saw the whole city was destroyed, burnt with fire, and the people were gone. Now it says all of the people, David's army, they rose up and wanted to kill David. They wanted to stone him. At that stage, the bad day went real bad. He thought they lost everything. Not only did he not accomplish, I think, that little vision he had, but then things went to hell in a handbasket, so to speak. And they wanted to kill David. That's about the lowest point you've read of David up until this time in his story. They said, forget it. See, leadership, Moses, many of the leaders in Scripture, that's one of the things you deal with at a time where people say, oh no, let's kill this guy. That's where you have to really be with God when you, whatever road of ministry you're on. Now, David does something I think that also is unique in the sense most kings would have immediately went after that enemy that came and took their wives and their kids. And back in those days, the enemies often would kill everybody. Look, David was doing that himself in the other fights. But what David does is he gets the priest and they do a little ritual, but it was the prescribed method to approach God. And David asks God. And I believe David does not know at this point whether his wives, and he had two wives, okay? The one from Nabal, which was sweet Abigail, and another wife. David had two, and they were taken. As far as he knows, I don't think he realizes whether they're alive or dead. And so they seek God, and he asks God at this stage. This is Samuel 30, verse 6. David was greatly distressed, for the people spake of stoning him. The soul of all the people is grieved. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, Bring the ephod, and let's seek God, let's ask. And David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue? Shall I go after them? Most kings would have just went. Most warriors would have just went and pursued. But he's seeking God. He's asking direction. And God said, pursue, you will overtake them, and without fail recover all. And I believe David does not realize until God says to him, you will recover all, that he knows that his wives and the families of the other fighting men were not yet killed. Because the narrator writing Samuel at that point will tell you in the story, as he's writing it after the fact, that the women were not killed and all. But in the actual midst of it, as it's happening real time, David, I don't think, knows yet. Until God says you will recover all. So he heard a word from God that had to give him enough confidence that all of the people were not killed yet, the wives and all. Now he begins going after them. They find an Egyptian, and I'll just finish this chapter. And the guy was part of the raiding team that attacked David, and they kind of questioned him and give him some food. And David finally finds out where the group is that took all of their stuff. And he's going to go fight them because God had said, you will fight them, you will recover all. But on this little journey to get the enemy, to recover his family and all that was taken from their town of Ziklag, he has a 600-man army still at this point, David has, and 200 of them are too tired to cross a certain brook. I think it was called Besor. So the 200 men that are tired, this is important here, they stay. They stop, and they don't go all the way to the battle, but David takes the 400 men with him, and he gets the enemy who attacked him. And he has his 400 men that were disgruntled, they were ready to stone him earlier. He encouraged himself in the Lord, the Bible says, and they recovered everything. And then on the way back, everything was recovered. The women were not killed, the kids were not killed, God fulfilled the prophecy. And on the way back, the 200 men that didn't go all the way into the battle, David was going to share all of the spoils and all of the other things they brought back, besides what was stolen. They got extra because God blessed the battle. And the other guys in the army, the 400 that went, said about the 200 that didn't actually go into the battle. The 400 said, no, we don't want to give anything to these 200 because they didn't bear the heat of the day. You see, they didn't go all the way. We feel we are more justified in keeping the bounty and the spoils from the battle, the treasures that we have recovered. We feel we're justified because we went out there and did it. But these 200 that didn't go, they don't get any. And David rebukes his men. And he says, that which God has given you in this battle, that's God's gift to you. That's not something you earned. And therefore, David makes a decree and a statute forever in Israel that the goods and the treasures that those who felt they were more worthy because they went into the battle, they will be shared equally with those who seemed less worthy. And that's such a type of the gospel. And that's so important because David's made a ruling that was in keeping really with one of the greatest stumbling blocks of the history of Israel at the time of Christ. Many of the parables deal with the mindset of the people of God, Israel, in the time of the first century, how they did not receive Jesus as the Messiah. And one of the main reasons was that feeling of these other people are not as worthy, the Gentiles. This Messiah, this Jesus who's healing all the Gentiles, loving on all these people. There's a prophecy that says, thou hast ascended on high, thou hast led captivity captive, thou hast received gifts for men, even for the rebellious also, that God might dwell among them. That's an Old Testament prophecy, I think Isaiah, of Christ. So the ministry of Jesus was one of, I'm going to take all these treasures, all these wonderful gifts, primarily redemption, and I'm going to lavishly give it to those who you deem unworthy. And in the parables of Jesus, the parable of the prodigal son, it deals with that. The older brother says, I was with you all this time, Father, and you never did all this for me, but yet this other one who went out, he was not worthy that you would make this great buffet and kill the fatted calf and put on the ring and the robe and all. These parables of Jesus are dealing with that mindset that King David, at this stage of the journey, many hundreds of years before Christ, is displaying a Christ-like characteristic by saying, those that you think are not worthy of the gifts, those who you think did not go and bear the heat of the day, and many of the parables are like that. Go back and read the parables of Jesus. Some guy goes out and hires a bunch of servants, and throughout the day he says, I'll give you a penny, I'll give you a penny, I'll give you a penny. And then the guys that he hired near the end of the day, see the parables? And then the people all got mad that worked all day. And the master said, but look, I agreed to pay you this much, but we're mad because you paid the others the same. And they didn't work all day. They didn't go all the way to the battle. They didn't. And that whole mindset is a stumbling block that Paul the Apostle talks about in the letter to the Romans. But it says, but yet when God bestows this lavish grace upon the church, upon the Gentiles, upon those of us who were not partakers, we were not part of the Commonwealth of Israel, but amazingly through the cross, we've entered in all of these promises. And Paul says, and that's getting Israel jealous. Natural Israel got jealous. And so I like the story that David, in the battle, set down that principle. And the principle was that even those who didn't go all the way, they get to share it. Because David said, that which you have recovered, it wasn't you recovering it. That's what God gave you as a gift. And you began seeing it as something you earned, you see. And so that's one of the key symbols, again, of King David and of Christ. And that's really one of the main things you want to say. I think those 2 chapters I'm done. Let me just read that verse for you, the one I'm talking about. Verse 23 of Samuel 30. Then David said, Ye shall not do so, my brethren, with that which the Lord hath given us, who preserved us and delivered us, and the company that came against our hand. And it was so from that day forward that he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel unto this day, that those that did not go into the battle are also going to get the goods, the blessings, all right? So what did I do? About 26 minutes? We'll do one more of Samuel. I think that's the main. I don't like it waiting a few days before I talk about these because I want to keep the flow. And this is like 2 days after I should have made that video. So remember that principle. And even in ministry, the things that you're writing, or, you know, we got videos, ministries. I hear radio ministries, they still sell cassette tapes and stuff, you know. They're still, but try your best. Those of you that you say, I want to have an impact in society. I thank God that the Apostle Paul didn't live in a day where he could have copyrighted all those letters that God gave to him, the majority of the New Testament. But we live in a day where we need to be challenged on that. Whatever God has given you, ministers, you guys are writing books or making videos or doing things, make it as much as everything for me, I give it free, okay? Try to follow as much as you can some example of not seeing the gifts that God has given you as something that you have ownership over, okay? But the things God has communicated to you, these are free gifts, all right? I quoted, Thou hast ascended on high. Thou hast given gifts unto men, okay? And even the ministry gifts, the apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers, those are actually referred to as the gifts themselves. You ministers and people of God, you're a gift to the church. So you have this mandate to let that gift function without price, without charge, okay? Isaiah also says, let him who has no money come, and let him eat and let him take. So try to understand what your calling is a gift. It's a gift God has given to you. And you don't have ownership over it. You're a steward, okay? Steward comes from an interesting combination of words in the New Testament. Oh, I'm going to forget this. But it's a word about house or people group called oikos, and the word for economy. I think it's economia. I could be a little off on this. But stewardship basically means you have these things, these in the area of money and material things, but also in everything. The things you have, you're a steward of, okay? You're just holding them to give them away in the right time and the right place, okay? And don't withhold those things. Show yourself faithful. And not just the area of what most of us understand is whether it's a tithe or whether it's an offering, but in every area. The faithful, what God has given you for the house, for the oikos. And those two words are combined when we talk of stewardship. So give them Meet in due season. Meet in due season. That's stewards are faithful because they're communicating and you're giving it. Okay? All right, let's pray. Father, I thank you for all of our friends and for all of the people that are watching videos and reading these verses. And I just pray that you would empower them, help them to get what they can, that what you want to communicate to them from these teachings. I pray a blessing and an anointing on each one of them, that the Spirit of God would bless them, leadership in the kingdom, the apostles and prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers. Release gifts into everybody that watches these videos. Fulfill the promise that you'll pour out your Spirit on all of our seed, your blessing on all of our offspring. And those that will be of us will build the old waste places and make desolate cities to be inhabited. And we will be called repairers of the breach, restorers of paths to dwell in. Let your doctrine drop down like rain. Let your speech distill like dew, that everyone would receive these words. And from our right hand let a fiery law go forth, and let all the coastlands wait for the law. Amen.